Like the f-stops, the shutter speeds are at specific increments that allow, as you stop down or open up, that the light that strikes the sensor is either cut by 1/2 or doubled. So a specific relationship between shutter speed and f-stop exists, and we'll talk more about that. It's the most important function of your camera. But you should know some basics about shutter speeds. Generally, to hand hold your photographs, you want at least a medium speed shutter speed. So this is the length of time that your shutter, which is a curtain inside your camera, as you press the shutter release button, what happens is the curtain runs across, either it goes across or up and down, and it allows the light coming through the lens to strike your digital sensor, and then that curtain closes. And again, it does this at a high rate of speed. Medium speed, which you're going to want to hand hold your pictures at a minimum, a 60th of a second or 1/125th of a second. And 1/60th of a second is going to stop slow moving objects in motion. Somebody walking by, for example, a 60th of a second, if you included them, their feet might be out of focus, but their body probably would show up in focus at 1/125th of a second, even more so. For somebody that's walking fastly or riding a bike, you might want a faster shutter speed. 1/250th of a second is a faster or briefer instant of time than 1/60th of a second, for example. And so with fast shutter speeds for things that are moving quickly, or if the photographer is moving, you might want to use a fast shutter speed. Slow shutter speeds, usually something less than a 60th of a second. If you have a DSLR camera, less than a 60th of a second, you probably will not be able to handhold and have those images show up sharp without showing some camera movement. If you're using a mirrorless camera without that kind of clunky mirror system causing that in-camera vibration, then you might be able at a 40th or a 50th of a second handhold. Getting down to a 30th of a second is difficult to do. Maybe if you're leaning against the wall and holding really steady, you can do that. But for the most part, if you're hand holding, a 60th of a second and anything faster is what you want to shoot with. Well, just like I gave you some full f-stops, here's some full shutter speeds. 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, 1/15th, 1/30th, 1/60th, 1/125th, 1/250th. Well, you'll notice that there's a few aberrations in the math. You go from 1/8 to 1/15th. Well, shouldn't it really be 1/16th? Well, yes, it probably should. But, just because your camera says your shutter's 1/15th, it might be 1/14th and a half, or it might be 1/15th and a half. They're pretty close to perfect, but they're not exact. And so you're going to have a tiny bits of variance here and there. But frankly, you're talking about a variance so small that it's kind of immaterial. So what they did is they just made the math easier. So when you go from 8 to 15, well, 15 was easier to go from 15 to 30 than 16 to 32 to 64, etc. They're close. And the same thing happens. You go from a 60th instead of 120 to 1/125th of a second. Anyway, as you go to a higher fraction, that's a briefer instant of time, know that in most cameras, they don't list these as fractions. If they list the numbers, it's usually 1,000, 500, 1/250. And so again, if they're listed, it might just be this number. So don't be confused. It's not 250 seconds. It's 1/250th of a second. But shutter speed, you might want to, for some of your first pictures, you might want to, rather than do manual exposure, and we'll talk more about light meters, but you might want to do shutter speed preferred. And if you're outside, maybe you pick a shutter speed like 1/125th of a second, where you pick that, and then allow the camera to select the appropriate f-stop. But we'll come to that relationship momentarily. But just like the camera f-stops having 1/2 or 1/3 stops in between your different f-stops, between your different aperture openings, the shutter works the same way with most electronic digital cameras. You have full stops, so the ones I just showed you are full stops, 1/60th or 1/125th. 1/60th is twice the amount of light as 1/125. But just like your f-stops, most digital cameras have 1/3 or 1/2 stops in between, and some have 1/10 stops in between. Let's talk more about the shutter speeds. Here's an example of a fast and slow shutter speed. Again, I found this image on the internet, but it's a guy jumping for his camera, and you can see the fast shutter speeds pretty much stopped him in motion. You can see his features, you can count his individual fingers and things like that. The slow motion shows him as a blur. You can kind of see the movement. But the slow example, you can see a fair amount of blur. You can see the movement as he's leaped up. You can see his body and his face is a blur, harder to count his fingers and things like that. So fast and slow. So slow, usually less than 60th of a second. Fast, usually faster than 1/125th of a second. Another example. Somebody photographing a fountain. With a fast shutter speed, you can see individual drops of water stopped in midair. In the slow example, the water's more of a blur. Again, this is one of your creative control. What shutter speed you use. You can see photographing the racers here at 1/8 of a second. They become kind of blurred, abstracted forms. Or at 1/640th of a second, you see this guy stopped in midair. He's never going to quite hit because he's always just stopped there in full detail. Many of your cameras are going to allow you to use either bulb or time. Those are both for long exposures. On bulb, as long as you have your shutter depressed, this shutter stays open. On time, and these are indicated by a B or T, on time, you depress the shutter, it stays open until you depress it a second time. This is an image I made by campfire light up in Mount Lassen. And you can see in the foreground the trees are illuminated simply by the campfire. In the background, what you see, these are star trails. So in these long exposures, this was a 3-minute exposure. In relation to the stars, the Earth is spinning, and the stars will, instead of show up as little dots in the sky, end up being streaks because it shows the movement during that period of time. So the correspondence between shutter speeds and f-stops, it should be apparent. If f-stops allow 1/2 or twice the amount of its light of its neighbors, and the shutter speed does the same thing, there's a correlation between the two. So if I pick a shutter speed and f-stop based on the ISO that I'm using and the amount of light in the scene, and let's just say that I pick 1/60th of a second at f8. And I decide, well, at f8, that's a good amount of depth of field, but in this picture, I want to go for a shallower depth of field. I just want to focus on this face and not the trees in the background. And so I decide I want to open up from f8 to f5.6. By going from f8 to f5.6, I've opened up, I've doubled the amount of light. But now my exposure is going to be off. And so what I would do to compensate for that is I was set at 1/60th of a second. So I opened up the f-stop. I would close down the shutter speed. So now my shutter speed, I'd go from 1/60th of a second to 1/125th of a second. And interestingly, both exposures are going to have the exact same amount of light strike my digital array. So the exposure is the same, but the characteristic of the images are different. At a 60th of f8, I have a little more depth of field than I want. At 1/125th at f5.6, same amount of light strikes, but I have less of that depth of field for this photograph. That's what I want. And so you can take that relationship. And so once you know one shutter speed and f-stop combination, you can come up with a whole bunch of different shutter speeds and f-stop combinations that allow the exact same amount of light to strike your sensor. But the characteristic of each image would be different. The faster shutter speed you use, the more you're going to stop things in motion. But generally that's going to mean you're going to use a wider aperture opening, which is going to lessen the depth of field. It's going to lessen what's in focus from near to far. That's the most important function of your camera, is that relationship between shutter speeds and f-stops. If you understand that relationship, you understand the basic relationship of shutter speeds and f-stops in all cameras. Well, here's a little quiz for you. If my light meter indicates to me in the scene I'm photographing that with the ISO that I have set, my exposure should be 1/125th of a second at f11, and I decide I want it more depth of field, and I decide I want to stop down to f16, go from f11 to f16, and you can see those up here. So if I go from f11 and stop down to f16, what do I need to do to adjust my shutter for the same amount of light to strike my sensor? Start at 1/125th of a second at f11. I stop down to f16. Here's your answer, 1/60th of a second. So I stop down with my f-stop. I open up with my shutter speed. Or vice versa, if the case applies. So let's just take this as our medium. 1/125th of a second at f8. That's what my light meter in this situation told me to photograph. Well, I tell my light meter, thank you, that's good information, but I have all these different options that have the same amount of light strike my film, so I'm going to make my light meter happy, but I have different creative controls. At 1/15th of a second at f22, I have the same amount of light strike the sensor, but I have way better depth of field at f22 than I did at f8. But I'm also got a very slow shutter speed, and I can't handhold this, and if things are moving, they're going to show up as blurs. I have good depth of field at f16, and still a slow shutter speed. If I have something other than a DSLR, I might be able to handhold that. This is a decent option, the 60th of a second. If I want to get a little more depth of field, I can still handhold. So as long as things aren't moving quickly in front of my lens, that would work. But I have these options of faster shutter speeds as well. All these combinations of shutter speeds and f-stops have the exact same amount of light strike the sensor, but the characteristics of the image is different. With the fast shutter speed, I'm going to stop even quickly moving things, but I'm going to have very little depth of field in that particular image. So this is the creative control on your camera. What shutter speed and f-stop combination to use based on what ISO you have set and the amount of light,